January 22, 1944. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring received the news. At his headquarters in Italy, Allied forces had landed at Anzio, a beach town 30 miles south of Rome, behind German defensive lines. The landing was completely successful. 36,000 troops came ashore in the first wave with minimal resistance. Hundreds of ships unloaded men and equipment onto beaches that were barely defended. The Allies had achieved total tactical surprise, landing an entire corps in the German rear, with nothing between them and Rome, except some scattered coastal defense units and confused headquarters staff. By every military calculation, Kesselring's position was hopeless. The Gustav Line, the fortified defensive barrier, where German forces had stopped the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula, was now threatened from behind. German armies defending Monte Cassino were about to be cut off. The road to Rome was open. The Italian campaign, which had bogged down into brutal attrition warfare in the mountains, was about to collapse. Except it didn't. Kesselring looked at the situation and saw not disaster but opportunity. The Allies had landed an army on a beach supplied only by sea with limited room to maneuver, and they had stopped advancing. They had put themselves inside a box and locked the door from the inside. Kesselring understood immediately what the Allied commander, American Major General John P. Lucas, apparently did not. Armies that land behind enemy lines must move fast or die. Lucas had stopped. He had prioritized consolidation over exploitation. He had chosen caution over aggression, and that choice gave Kesselring time to scrape together forces from across Italy and Europe, time to surround the Anzio beachhead, time to turn what should have been a German disaster into one of the most successful defensive operations in military history. This is the story of Anzio told from the German side, the story of how a catastrophe became a containment, how a desperate improvisation became a textbook defensive victory, and how one German field marshal turned the Allies' best idea into their worst nightmare. Kesselring was 58 years old in January 1944, a career officer who had transferred from the German army to the Luftwaffe in the 1930s and risen to command air fleets during the invasions of Poland and France. By 1943, he was Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for all German forces in the Mediterranean theatre. Italy was his responsibility, his problem, and increasingly his obsession. After the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian surrender in September, Kesselring faced an impossible strategic situation. Hitler wanted Italy defended. The German High Command wanted forces withdrawn to defend more important theatres. Kesselring had to balance both demands with insufficient resources, unreliable Italian allies who had switched sides, and Allied forces that outnumbered and outgunned him. His solution was defensive. Genius: create fortified lines across the Italian peninsula, use the mountainous terrain to negate Allied advantages in armour and air power, make the Allies pay in blood for every mile delay them, long enough that the Italian campaign became strategically irrelevant compared to the upcoming invasion of France. The strategy was working. By January 1944, the Gustav Line anchored on Monte Cassino had stopped the Allied advance cold. Allied forces were bleeding themselves white against German defences, making no progress, accomplishing nothing. Then Anzio happened. The Anzio landing was supposed to break the stalemate. Allied planners, frustrated by the slow progress up the Italian peninsula, conceived an amphibious end run around German defences. Land a corps at Anzio, march on Rome, cut German supply lines to the Gustav Line force. A German retreat or risk encirclement. It was a good plan in theory, imaginative, aggressive, potentially decisive. It had worked in Sicily when Allied forces landed at multiple points and German defences collapsed. It should have worked at Anzio, but it required speed. The entire concept depended on rapid exploitation on Allied forces moving inland, immediately seizing the Alban Hills that dominated the approaches to Rome, cutting Highway 6 and Highway 7, the main supply routes to German forces defending Monte Cassino. If the Allies could cut those highways within the first 24 hours, Kesselring's position would become untenable. His forces at Monte Cassino would be trapped, his defences would collapse, Rome would fall, and the Italian campaign would end in Allied victory. Everything depended on speed, and speed was exactly what the Allies didn't have. Major General John P. Lucas commanded 6th Corps, the force assigned to the Anzio landing. Lucas was cautious, methodical, 54 years old, a capable staff officer promoted beyond his optimal level of command. He had doubts about the operation. He wrote in his diary before the landing that he felt the plan was risky, that he lacked sufficient forces, that he was being sent on a forlorn hope. His orders were contradictory: land at Anzio, advance on Rome, but also secure the beachhead and don't take unnecessary risks. Lucas interpreted these orders conservatively. When his forces landed on January 22nd and encountered minimal resistance, Lucas ordered them to halt digging, consolidate the beachhead, and wait for additional forces before advancing inland. It was the safe choice. It was the cautious choice. It was the wrong choice. Lucas spent the critical first 48 hours building defences around the beachhead instead of exploiting inland. He created a perimeter and fortified it. He unloaded supplies and organised logistics. He did everything by the book, except the one thing that mattered: he didn't advance. And every hour Lucas delayed was an hour Kesselring used to mobilise a response. When Kesselring learned of the Anzio landing on the morning of January 22nd, his immediate reaction was to assess what forces he could scrape together. He had almost nothing in the area: a few coastal defence battalions, some headquarters units, scattered garrison troops. Against 36,000 Allied troops with tanks and artillery, these forces were laughably inadequate. But Kesselring didn't need to defeat the Allies immediately. He needed to contain them long enough to bring reinforcements. He needed to buy time. His first order was to every unit within marching distance of Anzio move toward the beachhead, establish blocking positions on roads, leading inland, delay Allied advances by any means necessary. Units responded immediately. A reconnaissance battalion here, an anti-aircraft battery there, a company of engineers, a battalion of paratroopers. Whatever was available moved toward Anzio, not to attack, but to slow, to block, to create the impression of organised resistance, even when no organised resistance existed. It was improvisation at its finest, a defensive line conjured from nothing through speed and audacity. Simultaneously, Kesselring began pulling units from other sectors. He ordered divisions from northern Italy to move south. He requested reinforcements from Germany, from France, from the Balkans. He contacted Luftwaffe units and ordered them to attack Allied shipping at Anzio. The beachhead depended entirely on supplies from the sea, and interdicting those supplies would cripple Allied operations. He ordered artillery units to positions overlooking the Anzio plain, where they could bombard the beachhead. Within 24 hours, Kesselring had created a thin cordon around Anzio, assembled from units that hadn't existed as a coherent force the previous day. Within 48 hours, that cordon was becoming a defensive line. Within 72 hours, it was a fortified perimeter strong enough to stop Allied advances. The speed of German response was extraordinary, possible only because Lucas had given them time. The German build-up at Anzio was a logistical miracle improvised under pressure. Units arrived from everywhere: the 4th Parachute Division from southern France, the 65th Infantry Division from the Balkans, elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division from northern Italy, the 715th Infantry Division from southern France. Heavy weapons arrived: Tiger tanks, assault guns, mobile artillery. By the end of January, Kesselring had assembled 8 divisions around Anzio, approximately 70,000 troops of force, roughly equal to the Allied beachhead garrison. He had built this force from nothing in 8 days, pulling units from across occupied Europe, coordinating rail movements and road marches, positioning forces without detailed planning or preparation, creating a coherent defensive front through sheer force of will and organizational competence. It was perhaps the most impressive example of German operational flexibility in the entire war, the ability to respond to crisis with speed and efficiency that Allied forces could rarely match. Kesselring's defensive strategy at Anzio was based on simple principles: contain the beachhead, prevent Allied breakout, make the position as costly as possible to hold. The Anzio plain was ideal defensive terrain from the German perspective. It was flat open, offering no cover for attacking forces. The Alban Hills rose just beyond the plain, providing elevated observation points where German artillery spotters could direct fire onto any Allied movement. Roads leading inland from the beaches were easily blocked and covered by anti-tank guns. The beachhead perimeter was compact, only 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep at its maximum extent, making it easy to defend and difficult to break out from. Kesselring ringed the beachhead with artillery dug in infantry in fortified positions, positioned mobile reserves behind the lines, ready to counterattack any Allied breakthrough attempt. He turned Anzio into a prison, and the Allies were locked inside. The psychology of the situation favoured the Germans. Allied forces at Anzio were besieged, surrounded under constant bombardment. German artillery fire fell on the beachhead day and night, not heavy enough to destroy Allied positions, but constant enough to inflict casualties, disrupt sleep, damage morale. The artillery was nicknamed Anzio Annie by Allied soldiers, though it was actually multiple guns, including rail-mounted artillery, firing from positions in the Alban Hills. Shells would arrive without warning, exploding in supply dumps, command posts, field hospitals. There was no safe area on the beachhead. Frontline soldiers and rear echelon troops were equally vulnerable. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers developed what would later be called combat fatigue, or PTSD, breaking under the relentless stress of random death. Units lost effectiveness not from casualties, but from cumulative strain. And the Germans observing from the hills could see everything, every Allied movement, every supply build-up, every preparation for attack. German artillery observers would call fire missions on targets of opportunity, hitting Allied forces before they could even begin operations. Kesselring also coordinated with Luftwaffe forces to attack Allied shipping. German bombers struck at night using radio-guided glide bombs, the same weapons that had nearly sunk Allied ships during the Salerno invasion. The attacks were moderately effective, damaging several ships, disrupting supply operations, forcing the Allies to maintain extensive anti-aircraft defences around the beachhead. More importantly, the air attacks created additional psychological pressure. Allied forces at Anzio felt isolated, cut off, abandoned. Supply shortages developed not because supplies weren't being shipped, but because the shipping couldn't keep up with demand and losses. Ammunition was rationed, food was limited, medical supplies ran low. The beachhead became a desperate place where soldiers endured rather than fought, where survival replaced victory as the operational objective. By early February, Kesselring was ready to move from containment to counterattack. Hitler wanted Anzio eliminated. The beachhead was an embarrassment, a constant threat, a propaganda problem. Kesselring disagreed with Hitler's priorities. He believed containing Anzio was sufficient, that resources devoted to attacking the beachhead would be wasted, that the Allies were already trapped and harmless. But Hitler insisted, and Kesselring obeyed. He planned Operation Fishfang, a major counteroffensive, aimed at splitting the Allied beachhead, reaching the coast, and destroying Allied forces piecemeal. The attack would come down the Via Anziate, the main road from Campiglione toward Anzio town, with the objective of driving a wedge through the Allied centre and reaching the sea. If successful, Fishfang would accomplish what no other German operation in Italy had managed: the complete destruction of an Allied corps. If unsuccessful, it would at least inflict casualties and demonstrate German strength. Operation Fishfang launched on February 16, 1944. German forces attacked with 3 divisions: Infantry Lehr Regiment, 65th Infantry Division, and elements of 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by Tiger tanks and heavy artillery preparation. The attack achieved initial success, penetrating several miles into Allied defences, overrunning forward positions, capturing prisoners. For a few days, the German offensive looked dangerous, potentially decisive. But Allied forces stabilised the line through desperate fighting, massive artillery fire, and naval gunfire support from ships offshore. German advances slowed, stalled, stopped. Allied counterattacks pushed German forces back. By February 20th, Fishfang had failed. German casualties were heavy, approximately 5,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Allied casualties were comparable. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory, But the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Allies were still trapped at Anzio. The Germans still contained the beachhead and the stalemate continued. Kesselring drew the correct conclusion from Fishfang's failure. Attacking Anzio was pointless. Containment was sufficient. He shifted back to defensive operations, maintaining pressure on the beachhead, but not attempting additional major offensives. This decision frustrated Hitler, who continued to demand that Anzio be eliminated, but Kesselring understood strategic reality better than Hitler did. Germany didn't have unlimited resources to waste on attacks that wouldn't change the strategic situation. Italy was a secondary theatre by early 1944. The upcoming Allied invasion of France, everyone knew it was coming. The only question was where and when would be the decisive battle. German forces needed to be preserved for that battle, not frittered away attacking a contained beachhead in Italy. Kesselring's containment of Anzio freed him to maintain the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, which continued to block Allied advances up the Italian peninsula. As long as both positions held, Germany controlled the pace of operations in Italy, and the Allies accomplished nothing. The stalemate at Anzio lasted 4 months. From late January through late May 1944, Allied forces sat in the beachhead, enduring constant bombardment, launching occasional attacks that gained nothing, slowly grinding away their strength through casualties and attrition. German forces maintained the containment, rotating units through frontline positions, keeping pressure on Allied forces, preventing breakout. It was attritional warfare at its worst. Both sides losing men for no gain, both sides suffering for no purpose. Both sides locked into positions neither could abandon. For Kesselring, this was victory. Every week the Allies spent, trapped at Anzio, was a week they weren't advancing elsewhere. Every casualty the Allies took at Anzio was one less soldier available for future operations. Every resource committed to sustaining the beachhead was diverted from other theatres. Anzio had become a strategic sinkhole, consuming Allied strength while accomplishing nothing. The breakout from Anzio finally came on May 23, 1944, coordinated with a renewed Allied offensive against the Gustav Line. After 4 months of preparation, massive reinforcement, and elaborate planning, Allied forces at Anzio attacked in conjunction with Allied forces at Monte Cassino. The combined offensive broke through German defences. Kesselring, faced with simultaneous threats and insufficient forces to contain both, made the rational decision to conduct a fighting withdrawal. German forces retreated north toward Rome, and on June 4, 1944, American forces entered Rome, the first Axis capital to fall. It was a propaganda victory for the Allies, but strategically it meant little. German forces withdrew in good order, established new defensive lines north of Rome, and continued fighting. The Italian campaign would continue for another year, grinding forward at terrible cost, never becoming the decisive theatre Allied planners had envisioned. From the German perspective, Anzio was a successful defensive operation, a strategic victory that delayed Allied progress for 4 months and inflicted disproportionate casualties. The Allies landed over 150,000 troops at Anzio over the course of the campaign and suffered over 43,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. German casualties were comparable in absolute numbers, but lower relative to forces committed. More importantly, Kesselring had contained what should have been a catastrophic threat, had prevented Allied breakout, had maintained control of the Italian campaign's tempo. The fact that Rome eventually fell was inevitable. German forces in Italy were always outnumbered and could only delay, not prevent, Allied victory. What mattered was how long the delay lasted and what it cost the Allies. Anzio cost the Allies 4 months and 43,000 casualties for minimal strategic gain. That was victory by any reasonable measure. Kesselring's performance at Anzio demonstrated several principles of defensive warfare that remain relevant. First, speed matters in defense as much as in offense. Kesselring's immediate response to the Anzio landing, his ability to mobilize forces and create defensive positions within days, prevented Allied exploitation. A slower response would have allowed Allied forces to break out before German defenses could form. Second, improvisation is essential in crisis. Kesselring didn't have prepared plans for responding to landings at Anzio. He improvised, pulling units from wherever they were available, creating a coherent defense from scattered forces. The ability to improvise effectively, to make do with inadequate resources, is what distinguishes great commanders from adequate ones. Third, psychology matters. Kesselring understood that containing the Allies at Anzio would demoralize them, that besieging forces that expected to be rescuers would break their will to fight. The constant artillery bombardment, the sense of being trapped, the failure to achieve objectives, these psychological factors were as important as physical casualties in degrading Allied effectiveness. There's a counterfactual worth considering. What if Lucas had advanced immediately after landing? What if Allied forces had pushed inland on January 22nd, seized the Alban Hills-cut Highway 6 and moved toward Rome? Could Kesselring have responded in time? The honest answer is probably not. The forces Kesselring assembled to contain Anzio took days to arrive. If Allied forces had been marching on Rome, from the first day German defences would have been inadequate to stop them. Rome might have fallen in January rather than June. The Gustav Line at Monte Cassino might have collapsed as German forces retreated to avoid encirclement. The Italian campaign might have ended months earlier. But Lucas didn't advance, and that caution gave Kesselring the time he needed. There's a military maxim that says the best defense is to make the enemy commander cautious. Lucas was naturally cautious, reinforced by contradictory orders from his superiors. Kesselring exploited that caution perfectly. Allied command decisions contributed to Anzio's failure. Lucas was relieved of command in February and replaced by Major General Lucien Truscott, a more aggressive commander. But by then the opportunity was lost. The Allies had reinforced the beachhead, built extensive fortifications, settled into a defensive mindset. Truscott conducted the eventual breakout in May, but that operation required massive preparation and coordination. It wasn't the rapid exploitation that should have happened in January. Allied High Command also deserves criticism for inadequate planning. The Anzio operation was conceived hastily resourced, inadequately, and executed without clear objectives. Churchill pushed for Anzio as a way to break the Italian stalemate, but he couldn't provide the resources necessary for success. Eisenhower, preparing for the Normandy invasion, diverted resources away from Italy. The Anzio operation fell into the gap between what was desired and what was feasible, and Lucas became the scapegoat for failures that weren't entirely his fault. German defensive operations in Italy throughout 1943 to 1944 represent high-level military competence. Kesselring commanded outnumbered forces against enemies with superior resources, air superiority and logistical advantages. He couldn't win decisively, the strategic balance was too unfavourable. But he could delay, frustrate attrite. Allied forces make them pay maximum cost for minimum gain. That's exactly what he did. The Italian campaign became a brutal slog where Allied advantages meant little, and German defensive expertise meant everything. Monte Cassino, Anzio, the Gothic Line. Each defensive position forced Allied forces to fight costly battles for marginal gains. By the time Italy was secured, the war in Europe was effectively won elsewhere. D-Day had succeeded. Soviet forces were driving toward Germany from the east, and Italy had become strategically irrelevant. Kesselring's defensive campaign couldn't change the war's outcome, but it delayed Allied progress and inflicted costs that affected Allied capabilities elsewhere. After the war, Kesselring was tried for war crimes related to reprisal killings of Italian civilians. He was convicted and sentenced to death later, commuted to life imprisonment, later released. His military reputation remained intact. Military historians generally regard him as one of the most capable defensive commanders of World War II, a master of improvisation and operational flexibility. His performance at Anzio specifically is studied as a case study in defensive operations, how to respond to crisis, how to create something from nothing, how to turn enemy success into enemy failure through speed and competence. The fact that he contained Anzio with improvised forces against overwhelming Allied advantages is remarkable. The fact that he maintained that containment for 4 months while simultaneously defending other sectors is extraordinary. The Anzio campaign revealed fundamental differences between German and Allied operational approaches in 1944. German forces, despite deteriorating strategic position, retained tactical excellence and operational flexibility. German commanders were authorized to make decisions to improvise, to respond to local situations without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Kesselring could pull units from across Italy without requesting permission for each move. He could coordinate with Luftwaffe forces without navigating bureaucratic processes. He could make strategic decisions and implement them immediately. Allied command structures were more rigid, more bureaucratic, slower to respond. Lucas needed approval for major operations, was constrained by contradictory guidance from multiple superiors, couldn't deviate from plans without risking relief. This rigidity cost the Allies at Anzio. By the time Allied command decided what should be done, Kesselring had already done what needed to be done. There's a final irony in the Anzio story. The operation was supposed to break the Italian stalemate by outflanking German defences. Instead, it created a new stalemate that lasted 4 months. The operation was supposed to force German withdrawal by threatening their supply lines. Instead, German forces contained the threat and continued holding their main defensive line. The operation was supposed to demonstrate Allied operational brilliance. Instead, it became an example of how not to conduct amphibious operations. The Germans, who should have been defeated at Anzio, turned it into one of their most successful defensive operations. The Allies, who should have won easily, turned it into one of their most embarrassing failures. The gap between expectation and reality was total. Kesselring looked at Anzio and saw opportunity where everyone else saw disaster. He saw that time was the crucial variable, that every hour the Allies delayed was an hour he could use. He saw that defensive positions could be improvised if you moved fast enough. He saw that Allied forces in a beachhead were vulnerable, isolated, dependent on shipping that could be attacked. He saw all this instantly and acted immediately, and his vision and speed turned a crisis into a victory. That's what great commanders do. They see opportunities others miss, make decisions, others hesitate, overact, while others wait. Kesselring wasn't fighting with better resources or superior forces. He was fighting with better understanding and faster execution. That was enough. The Battle of Anzio, from the German perspective, is a story about defensive excellence, operational improvisation, and the decisive importance of speed in crisis response. It's a story about how a field marshal with inadequate resources defeated an Allied corps with overwhelming advantages through sheer competence and audacity. It's a story about how Allied operational mistakes, caution when aggression was needed, hesitation when speed was required, allowed those advantages to become irrelevant. It's a story about how war is won and lost, not just by material factors, but by human decisions, by commanders who see opportunities and act on them, versus commanders who see risks and avoid them. Kesselring saw opportunity, Lucas saw risk. That difference determined everything, and for 4 months from January to May 1944, the German defensive perimeter around Anzio held an improvised fortress built from nothing that contained an Allied army and demonstrated that sometimes in war, the trapped army is not the one that's surrounded, but the one that refuses to move. Anzio was supposed to be Germany's disaster. Instead, it became Germany's triumph. And Kesselring, the field marshal who turned catastrophe into containment, deserves recognition as one of the great defensive commanders in military history. The man who saw the trap that wasn't supposed to work and made it perfect.